All right, there we go. So you will, I assume, remember that a few weeks ago I launched a new lecture series with you, and then that last week I took a detour and spoke about the debt ceiling and the crisis and what it reveals about the fragility of our economy and the way in which the Republican Party has become hostage to its chaos caucus. Not going to talk about that this week. Going to go back to the topic of the lifespan revolution, the fact that we're living, and these figures are approximate, but 30 years longer than we were living 100 years ago, that we have an extra third of a lifespan as a result, and that this is a fact, a demographic fact, a medical fact that seems not to have fully registered at the level of cultural consciousness, let alone social reform. And so that there are issues of justice, issues to do with the nature and distribution of care for people who are living longer, and then ethics of a first person challenge. How do we make the maximum meaning out of a longer life, and that I think these are issues that it's constructive and important for us to start talking about together. And so that's the focus of this lecture series. I'm going to return to that today. I'll refresh your memories a little bit about where we kind of started in terms of the basic demographic fact here, that for most of human history, the human lifespan has been 20 to 30 years. With the Industrial Revolution, it expanded to 40 to 50 years. With the coming into being of antibiotics, vaccination, better nutrition, better sanitation, it is now the case today that a person born in a developed society is more likely than not to live to 100 years. So a very rapid transformation that is quite radical of the human lifespan, and the suggestion being that we really need to think carefully about the implications of this, and the idea that ageism is perhaps the last, or among the last, tolerated forms of widespread social prejudice. I'm starting to teach this material at Sarah Lawrence as well. In a preliminary meeting with my students, I asked for a show of hands. Who in this class has not said something stereotyping about the elderly? Not a single student raised their hand. And I think had I asked the same question about race or gender or sexuality, at least minimally, they would have felt a lot of social pressure to say, well, no, I've never done that. But more likely, they probably haven't done that. They've lived through a period of cultural transformation in which it became clear that that is impermissible, right? We don't do that anymore. But ageism still seems to be broadly tolerated in our society. And frankly, our society is built on ageist assumptions. We internalize those assumptions often, and we do ourselves a disservice when we don't actually recognize what is happening in our society and our lifespans, and in particular, not just our lifespans, our health spans, right? And so you can increase the amount of time somebody has on earth without increasing the amount of healthy time they have on earth. But that isn't what's happened. This diagram gives you the basic, right, distinction that you can have the same lifespan, but the period within that life that is healthy, that you have full agency, full capacity to do what you want to do, can be shorter or longer. And the objective, many of the people I'm reading suggest, has to be not just to increase lifespan, but to also increase health span. That is, in fact, what is happening. And as you can see, well into their late 70s, we have 80 to 90% of individuals reporting that they don't experience any health-based limitations. When you get into your 80s, it's still upwards of 75% of people, 3/4 of people who do not experience health-based limitations on their ordinary activity. I think that that again is dissident with our stereotypes and needs to be taken into account. I've drawn on the head of the Stanford Center for Longevity, one of the pioneers in this field, Laura Carstensen, as giving us a kind of, I think, very succinct indication of the problem, which is to say that we live in a society that still was designed for a vanishingly small portion of the population being over 65 years old. But instead of 4%, where it was 100 plus years ago, today it's closer to 20%. 1 in 5 people in the contemporary United States of America who are over 65, we have not adjusted. And I won't reproduce Carstensen's diagram. It's a little busy and not particularly informative, but I like the basic idea that you can put on one axis your age and the other axis your axis of a diagram, your access to a full range of social goods. And rather than living in a society that assumes that as you age, your access goes down and down and down, we should aim to live in a society that extends maximal access to health, to work, to financial security, to social connectivity, to meaningful leisure outlets across the full life span. And so that's, in a sense, the organizing idea for these lectures. We started a few weeks ago by looking at one of the true pioneers in this field, Louise Aronson, who is a geriatrician, a medical doctor who specializes in the treatment of the elderly, and a professor at the University of California at San Francisco. And her book, Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine, Reimagining Life, is one of the clarion call books in this field saying, look, we really have to rethink medicine, and we really need to, in a sense, remove the monopoly for controlling how we conceive of the later years of our life that medicine currently has, because medicine is not well equipped to help us think through in a humanistic, existential, well-rounded way what we should be doing with our longer lives. And so her suggestion, right, and I want to keep this as clear as possible. I like this framework, right, which is to say that there are 3 distinct phases in a 21st century human life, assuming that we're fortunate enough to live in the developed world and to not succumb to an accident or disease early in life: childhood, adulthood, and elderhood. And that we have gotten pretty good, and let us remember that this is a relatively recent development of treating childhood as independent from adulthood and judging it by its own internal standards. If we were to judge childhood from the perspective of adulthood, we would view children as deficient adults. They can't do all the things that an adult is supposed to do, right? But for around 150 years, we stopped judging children that way and started recognizing that that's inappropriate, that they're in a different phase of life, they're going through developmental processes, and the appropriate standard for judging them is internal to their phase of life. And Aronson says we need to do the same thing with elderhood. It is not the case that people who are 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 years or older are merely deficient 40 or 50 years olds, they are going through a distinct phase of life, and their capabilities, their potential, their sources of meaning, the level of care they require should be judged by standards internal to that phase of life. And that in particular, each of these phases has multiple stages or sub processes. And medicine has mainly judged the elder from the perspective of adulthood. And that's a mistake and results in a treatment of the elderly that is incompatible with maximizing health span and well-being. So this is review. I'm not going to go through all of this again, but where we left off 2 weeks ago is Aronson's critique of the medicalization of aging. And I actually did a fair bit of background work in terms of thinking about all of these different sources we could draw on to do a social history of how medicine gained the power to define our relationship to our bodies as we age, our relationship to our minds and brains as we age, our relationship to the process of aging, and how, in many ways, it has employed a disease model for aging, that aging does, it's a fact of the matter, tend to increase the vulnerability to the propensity for disease. But having said that, to conflate aging with disease is, Aronson and others maintain, a huge mistake. And it's one that's been very costly for us because we have given so much power to medicine that, on the one hand, it has legitimated this discrimination, ageism. And on the other hand, many of us internalize this perspective. And the result is that we have a diminished sense of self, diminished expectations, diminished sense of our own possibility, right? And so that's where we left off, that medicine dehumanizes older patients and contributes to pervasive, unreflective ageism. That the effort to counteract this is currently located in a relatively less prestigious and dissident portion of the medical field, geriatrics. And even within geriatrics, there is a kind of dissident strain that Aronson represents. Hopefully, this is getting better, but that part of the problem here is that geriatricians have to refer their patients to other doctors, specialists, and that those specialists often don't have a more humanistic perspective on aging. Instead, they have a disease management and treatment perspective, and Aronson suggests that's a problem, that's a mistake. And so let me try to make this concrete. I'll come back to this slide in just a moment, but there are two things I want to share with you. And one of them, I think, is really fascinating and really important. This actually comes from the next book I want to talk with you about. This is Daniel Levitan's Successful Aging. I think I started talking with you about this a couple of weeks ago. But this diagram consolidates survey information from 72 different societies taken at different phases of life, asking people to describe their level of well-being. And what this shows, and again, this is a cross-cultural finding. It's a very robust finding. It's found in survey after survey, is that counter to the medical perspective, most people don't view being in elderhood as a period of decline, at least not in terms of well-being. That the period of life that actually has the highest rating of life satisfaction and well-being is the 80s. The happiest year in these surveys is 82 years old. And that actually, it turns out that the period that we tend to associate with maximum productivity, agency, health, vigor, the middle of life is the least happy period of life. And I want to say a couple things to make sense of this. One of them is that the period of life that has this low level of well-being, relatively speaking, is the period in which we have maximum responsibility. And it's interesting. Ruth is putting in the chat, we're the only group of Americans that have national health care. And yes, that's right. We've got the Medicare system. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if we had Medicare for all? But having said that, yes, one source of stress is how am I going to afford everything, right? And that includes medical insurance. My son just turned 26 years old, and so now I'm having to assist him with his medical insurance. He can no longer be covered on my policy, and it's not cheap, right? And having said that, right, the fact is that in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you are doing a lot of stuff that is quite stressful. You are getting your professional credentials. You are starting your career. You are perhaps starting a family or looking for relationships. You are trying to build financial security. You're having children. You're bearing those responsibilities. You may be part of the so-called sandwich generation, where you also have increasing responsibilities to your parents at the same time that you have responsibilities to your children, your spouse, your profession, right? And so there's just a high level of stress. Some people refer to this as the dolce vita effect, right? That life is sweet in your 70s and 80s because you have discharged all of these responsibilities and now you can just enjoy it. There's a second related psychological explanation for this, which I think is very important, which is that what you have to do in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s is often future oriented, right? You are building those credentials, that career, those networks. And so you don't put as much emphasis on current satisfaction, pleasure, well-being. It's a period in which you defer gratification, and that as you get later in life, it is no longer necessary to defer gratification, and the sense that life is no longer a realm of limitless possibilities to be maximized, but has an expiration date associated with it, also leads you to be more attuned to the present satisfaction. So, right, two slightly different explanations for why it is that people later in life are actually happier, have higher levels of well-being than people earlier in life. Now, that would be something, right, that the medicalization of age just doesn't account for very well. Yes, you're experiencing greater vulnerabilities, decline in some capabilities, but does that mean you're less well off? Not necessarily. Related then in terms of the way in which Leviton thinks we need to change the medical approach is by paying more attention to disability as opposed to mortality. And so again, health span versus lifespan. One way of thinking about Aronson's advice is that we should be trying to maximize the health span, and we should be giving those who are getting medical care greater agency in recognizing whether the treatment they're being offered or recommended is one that maximizes lifespan or health span or well-being, right? And so as you can see, and this diagram actually is collating information from the World Health Organization, and it is presented again in Leviton's book, Successful Aging, that the causes of death in the developed world of people 70 years or older: heart disease, stroke, cancer, right? And this is part of the transition from contagious disease to chronic disease that has happened in developed societies with antibiotics, vaccinations, better sanitation. We're living long enough that these chronic diseases are leading causes of death. But please note that when it comes to causes of disability, right, what people say actually prevents them from doing what it is they want to do with their lives, they're much smaller, right? And that actually pain and sensory loss, right, which tend not to be things that actually cause death, are major impediments to maintaining ability and agency. And if it turns out, as Aronson suggests, that some of what we do to treat these diseases increases pain, increases sensory loss, increases mental health issues, then we might need to present the health choice for somebody in their elderhood in a different framework than we do from somebody in adulthood, to say, well, yes, we can extend your life, but only at the cost of increasing your disability. Is that what you want? Which of those two options would you prefer? Or maybe we can start multiplying options to have a sliding scale where we can give you more healthy years. That this is what a different perspective on medicine would recommend. And so this then gets us to Aronson's overall approach to integrate a humanistic well-being based approach into contemporary medical and especially elder care. By the way, she does think that these lessons are not just relevant to elder care, that they should be taken into account in medical care in general. One of the criticisms you may remember from a couple weeks ago of American medicine in general that Aronson levels is that we have a for-profit medical system. Going back to Ruth's observation, not only does that create stress for everyone trying to pay for it, but it also creates perverse incentives for insurers and doctors within this system. And she hopes that this more humanistic approach can ultimately transform not just elder care, but medical care in general. So the first thing that she wants us to recognize is that old age in American society is socially constructed, and that medicine plays a very important role in the social construction of the aging process. She says throughout history, the experience of being old has been shaped by economics, social priorities, medical knowledge and technology, and our beliefs about life and health. And to be as clear as possible, right, the idea that the medical profession has the power to make decisions about your health and that you don't. The fact that our society often tends to segregate and marginalize the elderly, that we have a system of segregation for the elderly that looks a little bit like the system of segregation in the Jim Crow South. Put them in separate spaces, don't mix the ages. All of this, she thinks, is the product of a particular construction of aging, that things are different in different societies, were different in different historical periods, and that we need to recognize that these are not facts or fixed social necessities. These are things that we can renegotiate. She then suggests that geriatrics, when it's practiced appropriately, is a model for a different approach to medicine because it does not focus exclusively on physiology, disease, and curative treatments, because these are not often the main determinants of health and well-being. And if you remember in the previous week's lecture, we distinguished between disease and illness, where disease is the process of bodily impairment caused by a particular condition, and illness is the lived experience and perspective of the person who is experiencing the disease. And the suggestion here is that the physiological focus and the focus on curing the physiological dimension to the disease is too narrow in later life. That if you contract heart disease in your 40s or 50s, understandably, you think that you want to do everything in your power to cure it. But if it happens in your 80s, your perspective may be very different. So she says, in addition to curing disease, we need to also look at mobility and access. How will this treatment affect your ability to do the things to navigate the spaces that matter to you, your care network? And is it the case that putting you in a hospital and then a skilled nursing facility and then a rehab center is going to disrupt the social network that makes life valuable for you? Your independence and agency, your life goals, your values, your emotional health, your diet, your sleep, a much more holistic perspective, Aronson is suggesting, is required than contemporary medicine is currently incentivized to pay attention to. And she points out that doctors are generally not compensated at all to have these more holistic, well-rounded conversations. And the result is that many doctors just focus on the procedure because that is what their hospital, what their HMO, what their care group wants them to do, because that is what actually generates revenue and income. She then adds that most other medical specialties operate from what she considers to be a discredited and biased perspective that equates aging with disease and decline, and hence has a very narrow definition of health as disease. And that this is often incredibly deleterious, unhealthy for patients, in particular, that it often means that people who are elder are given the same treatment as people who are adults when their bodies have different chemistries, different levels of strength, different kinds of reactions. So she thinks that this is often a health disaster, and her book is full of frankly awful examples, pharmaceutical cascades in which an elder patient is assigned one medicine to treat one condition that gives a side effect, another medicine to treat the side effect that produces a side effect, and pretty soon the person is on 8 or 9 new medicines, and sometimes they're then misdiagnosed as suffering a kind of general degenerative condition when in fact it's all produced by the interaction of the pharmaceuticals, and that it is also dehumanizing for elder patients, that it treats them as objects, not as subjects, as patients, not as agents, as vessels for disease, not human beings with their own goals and understandings. She focuses on the specific indignity of nursing homes, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but she suggests that if we were less in the grips of the disease model of aging, we would not tolerate the warehousing of the infirm that we see in nursing homes, the way in which our overall mindset about aging creates a blind spot for the kind of dehumanization that occurs in skilled nursing facilities is, she thinks, going to be, in historical retrospect, a major indictment of our culture, of our moment in history. And so she wants to reform elder care, and in so doing, to suggest a model for reforming medicine in general. I think I should stop for a moment there. I want to move into new literature, a new book with you. But one of the things that I'm learning in reading this is, much as is the case with people in their teens and their 20s, so too for the rest of life, learning occurs best when it's interactive, when it's dialogic, when it's engaged. And that means I want to hear from you too. So I said before, I have some trepidations about the subject matter. I'm talking about a group to whom you belong in a rather objective way. What do you think? What do you think of Aronson? What do you think in general? And so I see Bonnie and Barbara. Bonnie, I'll start with you and then straight to Barbara.
Well, what I was thinking is that if you just go to the assisted living dining room at lunchtime, you'll find just about every person every type that was described there.
Yeah, and we're about to eventually, I should say, get into Ellen Langer's work. And I don't know if you're familiar with her, first woman tenured in psychology at Harvard, one of the main advocates of a mindfulness approach to psychology. And she spent a lot of her career working with assisted living and nursing homes. And one of the things she comes back to again and again and again is give people agency. I'll talk more about it, but she did a simple experiment where she went to a skilled nursing facility. She gave everybody a plant. And for one group, she said, this is your plant. Don't worry. The staff will take care of it for you. I just want you to have a plant in your room. And for the other group, she said, you're responsible for your plant. You got to figure out where in your room you want it, where in your room it's going to thrive. You have to water it. And she studied this group for 2 years, that the group that was responsible for its plant had better well-being, better health outcomes, greater longevity than the group that just treated the plant like a piece of furniture, right? And so maintaining agency, even over trivial things, helps to change your mindset as you age. Thank you for that, Bonnie. Barbara, go ahead.
Yes, I don't know if Aronson is addressing the question of cognitive decline. If an individual who lives alone is experiencing loss of ability to reason or understand time and dates, Um, is that addressed in her thinking, her problem solving?
It is, it's not the focus. And so I was just about to show you the next person that I'm going to speak about, Daniel Levitan, who's a neuroscientist, and he's really talking about that. And so I'll preview just for a second, Barbara, to say that what Levitan says is that, first of all, there's huge amounts of variability. And it's not just interpersonal, different people age in different rates. One of the things I discovered in doing this research, which I find to be just fascinating, is that there really are no biological markers of aging, right? So the old joke about, you know, inspecting the teeth of a horse to determine how old it is, you can't do that with a human being, right? They're literally, you need to know the biological age, the calendar age of the person, or else as a doctor, you cannot infer it. There's no agreed to approach. But having said that, one of the things that we do see with aging is intrapersonal in addition to interpersonal, that different aspects of our bodies and our minds decline at different rates. And one of the things Leviton emphasizes is actually that certain attributes of mind become more powerful as you age, and you can compensate. And so one of the things that he really emphasizes is what he calls conscientiousness. If you're having trouble with dates and time, right, then you get a big calendar and a big clock. If you're having trouble keeping track of your keys and it's frustrating you, you get a drawer where you always put your keys, and you remind yourself as soon as you walk into the room, I'm putting my keys there, right? It becomes habitual for you. And so, yes, there is definitely a lot said about this, and we're about to get into it in more detail. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Flossie, go ahead. But you remember you have to unmute yourself. That means you have to hit your space bar.
Yes.
There you go. Good.
Concerning agency, once or twice in the last 6 months, I have said to the doctor who was looking into the computer, I want you to look at me.
Yeah.
And it has worked. Because they're talking to the computer, they're not talking to me. And once they start talking to me, they, shall I say, change their prescriptions a little bit.
Yes. And Louise Aronson, I'll tell you a little bit more about something that happened to her and then related to what you're saying. So one of the things that I find very wonderful about her book is she's very candid about the fact that she suffered from burnout. And I didn't realize this, but burnout is a term that was invented by a psychologist treating doctors because it's so prevalent. 70% of medical professionals indicate at some point in their life they suffer from burnout. And that the rate of burnout has gone up since Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, mandated electronic medical records, EMRs. And so the reason your doctor is looking at the computer is that they've got this record keeping system that they have to fill out. And either they have to fill it out when they're in the room with you, or they have to do it at the end of the day. And what Aronson was doing was so that she could make eye contact and be in dialogue with her patients, she was doing it at the end of the day. But that was adding 3 or 4 hours to her day on a daily basis to do that, right? And of course, you've got to remember everything or reconstruct everything. And so one of the things that she noticed after she had she had a fairly complete mental breakdown. And so she was then the patient as opposed to the doctor. And that when you see a neurologist, a high prestige medical professional, they have medical scribes. So they look at you and somebody else is on the computer taking the notes. And so one of the things Aronson has done is try to work to get geriatricians medical scribes, so that they can make eye contact and be in dialogue and have a natural conversation with their patient, as opposed to being an appendage to a program for creating medical records. So yeah, very interesting comment, Flossie. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, so we have plenty more to cover. Let me go right back now into Daniel Levitan. And another really interesting scholar. He is a neuroscientist. He's done some really important neuroscience work, especially on the way in which the brain processes music. In neuroscience, there's something actually called the Leviton effect, which is referring to the fact that our memories generally are highly imperfect and unreliable. But one exception to this is pitch. And even if you sing miserably, like I do, apparently almost every human being has near perfect pitch memory for their favorite songs. They can recognize when it's in pitch and out of pitch without any memory distortion. And so he wrote a book that became a prize-winning and best-selling book. This is Your Brain on Music, and The Organized Brain, maybe another book you'd be familiar with. And then a couple years ago, he published Successful Aging. And I've found this to be a challenging but very illuminating book. It does not shy from some technical neuroscientific explanations, but it is also filled with narratives and stories. And part of what makes Levitan, I think, interesting is he spent a decade of his life being a musician. And he was a guitarist and was a record engineer. He worked in recording studios, and he did that before going to college. So he went to college later and then eventually became interested in neuroscience and got a PhD and became a professor. He works, he's from the Bay Area. He's from Moraga, California, not too far away. And he's also, so both Aronson and Levitan are from the Bay Area. He's also now, in addition to being a professor at McGill in Canada, one of the organizers of the Minerva Academy, not my Minerva Academy, but the hybrid college and university that is teaching students in the Bay Area and then sending them elsewhere and doing interesting online education. So he has an unconventional biography, but he is a leading researcher. And in particular, I think that he is doing very interesting popularizing work. So he does his own technical work, but then he also synthesizes and makes accessible a highly technical but very important field. We're really advancing very quickly in the way in which we understand the brain and its relationship to human cognition, or the broader phenomenon of the human mind. Obviously, you can't reduce it to just the brain, but it is located neuroanatomically within the brain. At least a lot of the mind is located there. So what does neuroscience teach about successful aging? And here I'm just going to start with two basic ideas that Levitan emphasizes. The first is what he calls the continually developing brain. And the technical term for this is neuroplasticity. And the, I think, point to emphasize is that for most of the last 100 years, the model of the brain has been one of tremendous growth in complexity and connectivity occurring in the first 20 years of life, especially actually from kind of 3 months, 4 months into fetal development into age 10, tremendous development, and then the next 10 years ongoing development. But then basically the brain is done at around age 25. And this had been the orthodox view in neuroscience until around 15, 20 years ago. And for the last 15 or 20 years, it's been challenged. And increasingly, the newly accepted view is no. Actually, on the one hand, new brain cells continue to develop all the way into your 80s. And to be as clear as possible, there are millions of brain cells. There are billions of synaptic connections between brain cells. There are more pathways for transmission within a human brain than there are particles in our galaxy, right? And so it's an organ of tremendous complexity. It takes 20% of the energy of the human body, and by volume it's only about 4% of the human body. So there's a lot going on in the brain. A lot of that complexity develops in the first decade, much more of it in the first 25 years, and then basically this period of intensive development stops. But that doesn't mean that learning stops. That doesn't mean that brain wiring stops. And that there are all kinds of examples of this. Perhaps my favorite, and to the best of my knowledge, Leviton doesn't actually talk about this, but you may be familiar with Robin Coates Lewis, the poet who won National Poetry Award for her first published collection, The Voyage of the Sable Venus. And in her 30s, she had a terrible accident, and it resulted in extensive brain damage. And she was told, she was already an academic, professor, you'll never write again. You'll never teach again. You'll never speak publicly again. And you'll never be able to have children. And as she points out, she's done all of those things, and she's done all of them successfully. And part of the reason she's been able to do all of those things is because it turns out the brain is remarkably adaptive, even after injury, even later in life. So we are generating new brain cells. We are generating new synaptic connections. We are capable of learning and developing all the way through life. That doesn't mean, and this comes back to Barbara's question, right, that we're not also experiencing mental decline, or that's far too general. Some decline in some aspects of cognitive ability later in life. That absolutely happens too. You can see it in the brain, you can feel it, you can experience it, but it's a complex process in which, on the one hand, there's some decline, on the other hand, there's ongoing learning, and there's the ability, in many respects, to compensate. And there is not only decline, but also improvement and learning that occurs all the way into the 80s and the 90s. So that's one big takeaway from the neuroscience of aging. The other big takeaway is that although a large portion of the way in which the brain develops and the kinds of capacities that your brain has in terms of intelligence, memory, functionality are genetic, right? There's a substantial genetic component to it. Genetics is not destiny, right? And that lifetime experience and environmental factors are extremely important, and that you can change the environmental factors, the experiential dimension in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And so you are not determined by your genetics or by your previous experience. You may have some structural constraints, but there's a lot of latitude to work within those constraints. And then, as I say, right, Leviton works at the intersection of neuroscience and personality research, among other things. And he's very interested in contemporary personality theory, which is more psychology than neuroscience. And one of the things that he takes away is variability of personality across persons, right? And we'll get into this in a moment, but psychology has spent a long time studying personality and trying to figure out what the best way to account for the differences in personality is. And there's growing consensus about different ways of measuring or thinking about personality variance. And this matters because personality is a big part of lifetime experience that interacts with genetics in determining what aging is going to be like for you. The other aspects of personality studies, the importance of culture, the very categories that we use to interpret ourselves, to fashion our conception of ourselves, are given to us by our culture. And that's not just a conceptual toolkit, right? Am I this kind of person or that kind of person? It's also a normatively loaded evaluative system. Is it a good thing to be gregarious or extroverted? My understanding, I've only spent a little bit of time in Finland, but is that the Finnish consider the Americans to be boorish in our degree of extroversion, and that if you're a Finnish person walking in a park or on a hike in a forest, you absolutely don't say hello to whoever crosses your path, because that would be an intrusion into their solitude. And this is a culture that values solitude. Obviously, America is a big and diverse place, and it has multiple cultures and attitudes within it. But generally, we don't consider saying hello to a stranger in a park, or even somebody we know in a park, to be an intrusion, right? And so culture shapes the way in which personality is expressed. Final thing that he emphasizes, Leviton emphasizes about personality, is that it is malleable. And so that you can change your personality if there are things about your personality that you don't like, or if there are things about your personality that you come to conclude are handicapping you. And he distinguishes between circumstantial and volitional change, that both of those kinds of changes are possible, but that the more important one is probably volitional, at least for our perspective in what we're talking about here today, which is to say, you can make a concerted effort to change aspects of your personality as you age in order to contribute to successful aging. So to conclude today, I'm just going to quote a little bit from Leviton. And I think really this quote, which is from the preface to his book on successful aging, captures the idea that is shared by much of the literature I'm reading in thinking about this topic right now. So it certainly, I think, would be echoed and agreed to by Aronson, that elderhood is a unique period of growth and happiness, and creating the social and individual conditions necessary to realize its full potential is a major challenge for 21st century society. And once we move away from ageism, from our stereotypes, from our medicalization and disease model of aging, and into an understanding informed by cognitive science, neuroscience, and frankly, just less poisoned by stereotype, we will recognize that we have failed in this regard so far. So here's what Leviton says. I've come to see a future in which we can plan ahead to fend off some of the adverse effects of aging, a future in which we can harness what we know about neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to continue to learn, to write our own next chapters the way we want them to come out. A future in which healthy lifestyle choices and a broader use of antidepressants and other medications can temper or reverse the effects of depression and other changes in mood that we have for too long assumed were an irreversible part of aging. I've come to see old age as a unique period of growth, a life stage with its own distinct character, rather than a period of decline or a gradual turning down of dials and knobs one by one. I argue here for a very different vision of old age, one that sees our final decades as a period of blossoming, a resurgence of life that does not chase after our younger years, but instead embraces the gifts that time can bring. And I think that in one sense, this might be a bit too exaggerated. It's not all a matter of will and choice and attitude. Circumstance, social support, care, security all matter. But I do think that as an aspiration, that quote from Leviton very much captures what it seems to me should be the goal for social reform, cultural change, as we reckon with the lifespan revolution. All right, so again, I want to open it up for questions. And as I say, Leviton really emphasizes that to learn, you have to engage. To remember, you have to be active. So again, I just want to emphasize, please engage, please be active. Who wants to start us out?
I guess I'll say something. I can't get my picture up there.
Who is this? Because I can't see you.
Iris Swindelgran.
Oh, hi, Iris. Go ahead.
The Zoom isn't working. We have an economic model in the United States that is simply incompatible at this point with our youth not being reproduced in numbers that will support us in our old age through Social Security. What are we going to do to foster the illness model with a care support system around every doctor? Years ago, when I was working in gerontology at a hospital, at a university, I asked to speak to a group of doctors, the medical society of my county. And I spoke with them about the need for elderly needing this care model. And would they each be willing to put in $20 a month toward a fund that would embrace the care of elders? They looked at me like I had just grown 2 heads. There was total silence. Nothing happened. And so, although that's a few years ago, I don't see much happening now. And I'd love to know if others see another model emerging and where the economic support is going to become possible.
So Iris, that's wonderful. And let me just point out, and as you start thinking about this, you begin to realize very quickly how much is being written about this. And so you may have seen that Francois Macron in France has proposed increasing the state mandated retirement age in France, I think from 62 to 64, if I have it right. And, by our standards, that still sounds pretty young, but the French are up in arms in resisting it. And on one hand, I get why they're resisting it. They feel like this is another technocratic, neoliberal adjustment of society to the market. But on the other hand, it seems to me, frankly, incredibly short-sighted, because what Macron is saying is, look, people are living longer and it's expensive. And so if we're going to, as the French do, have really good social security, really good support for medical care in later years, but not just medical care, home-based care. And I think that the literature is pretty good on this, that if you can age in place, oftentimes you age better, but that requires a robust network of support. Some people are lucky enough to have that provided by their own family members, but we can't assume that that's the case. The state has to be able to support that. Then the revenue coming in to the state has to be adequate to people's full lifetime needs, right? And so, Iris, I guess I would say I love the impulse behind what you suggested to your colleagues, but ultimately, I think it can't be voluntary. It has to be organized by the state. And then I want to add something, and Leviton emphasizes this. He says, don't retire, right? Ellen Langer puts it a different way, and she says, look, think of your life in decade or 15-year episodes and try to do something new and different in each episode. I don't think I've told you, I'm sorry if I have. I teach at another community. There's a woman there who's 93 years old, who retired from teaching French in high school at age 70 and then went to law school. She graduated from law school in her mid-70s and set up a law practice where she still works to this day a couple days a week, right? And she's very active, very smart. She's probably blessed genetically in terms of having her full physical mobility. She still drives at 93, right? But the idea, I think that part of the reason that she's doing so well into her 90s is probably that she has something that she finds really engaging, rewarding, and meaningful to do, right? And so the idea here, I think, is to capture that full complexity, rather than viewing people older than 65 as essentially no longer economically productive. We need to address ageism and age-based discrimination and say maybe post 65, and you may have seen the article in the Times about Japan and about people who are still doing hard physical, you might call it back-breaking work into their 60s and 70s because the pension system doesn't support them adequately. We don't want that, right? We don't want people doing work that they don't consider meaningful or that is actually not appropriate to their physical ability or bad for their health. But we do want people to have opportunities to continue to be productive, to continue to be engaged economically, socially, culturally, in the way that work often allows one to be. And so, right, two things there, right? Let people work longer, support people adequately in their retirement. Bob, did you have your hand up a moment ago?
I did, but it's a rather trivial point, and that your mention of the folks in Finland being sort of enclosed or whatever. They are also rated, I think, as the highest level of happiness in the world. So I don't know how those two relate, but it's
I'm not sure about that. I know that the Norwegians, the Costa Ricans also come out high, but there's a lot to I think go into happiness other than just a value placed on sometimes having solitude. I like solitude too, but I hope it shows like being socially engaged. John, Go ahead, and I am going to have to cut us off after a few minutes. I had that problem a couple weeks ago where we went on for so long I couldn't get the video uploaded because YouTube puts a limit on it.
My camera isn't working either. You're mentioning Japan. Ruth keeps shouting at me to say something about Japan, and I wasn't going to, but I can't resist you saying that. One thing to say about the US in the world perspective is the US is the youngest industrialized country in the world. And Japan is the oldest. US is about 20% 65 and over. Japan is 30% 65 and over. And so they have been dealing with this. I wrote a book about it actually called The Japanese Government and the Aging Society, but they have been dealing with this issue for quite a long time. Your anecdote seems to indicate that Japan is really screwed up and nobody can do anything, so people have to work in backbreaking labor. As compared to the US, nothing could be further from the truth. It is true, the US Social Security system is a better system than the Japanese pension system, but most people, in average incomes among older people is, I think, higher in Japan than it is in the US, although I'm not sure of that. But what I can say is that in the area of old age care, which is, I think, one of the really vital questions here. The US is about at the bottom of the list in long-term care, even though we do have Medicaid that helps some. But Japan is at the best. Japan has a public mandatory long-term care insurance system where everybody pays premiums up to age 40. Age 40 and above. And anyone, regardless of income, disability, well, only on the basis of disability, not on the basis of income or whether you're living with your family, is eligible for benefits, which can be in-home health care services and so forth, or it can be in a nursing home or a facility. And it's very widely used, and it works very well. I think it's a model for it's a little. Germans have a long-term care insurance system too, but it's not as generous and not as systematic. So with regard to public policies, it's tricky, and with regard to things in general, anecdotes can be a misleading approach to big things like how a country is for older people.
And I completely defer to your expertise on this, John. And I'm wondering if you have any spare copies of your book. I would love to take a look. I probably could go to the library too.
It might be. I can send you a PDF.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
It'll take you forever, though. It's got 11 long chapters.
Well, that's what I'm reading right now. I probably wouldn't read the whole thing, but I'd love to take a look. And you're absolutely right. And so this is the problem with looking at a single article in the New York Times is, the reporter found what he wanted to report on or she wanted to report on, and it does not give you a systematic or a perspective that is rooted in data that gives you an overall picture of the society. So point well taken. And then, the complexity of long-term care and governmental support for it. I don't know if you heard, I was kind of trying to sneak in while you were talking the idea that one of the reasons the United States has a relatively young population for an industrial society is due to immigration. And so it's not just rate of reproduction of the native population and then different rates of reproduction within recently arrived people as well. And so if one of the things we're learning as we look at, say, China and the problem of supporting older population is that it actually behooves us to have the right ratio of young to older persons in our society to support our welfare state, then that might be a pretty good argument for continuing to allow immigration. I think we do have to end it for today. If you have thoughts that we didn't get to, why don't we start off with a little bit of an opportunity to talk them over next week? I just am worried that if I don't stop, it's gonna be too big and we're not gonna get it online for people who weren't able to see it live. So Be well, take care. Thank you guys. And we'll be back together next Saturday. Bye-bye, everybody.